Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lynn, and in today's video I'll be making a double slider card where my very cute Abigail doll here changes her outfit from a nice sort of a springtime coral dress, and then she'll put on her winter coat and the background will be a nice snowy backdrop. So just a warning, this card making session contains a lot of errors. So I left all of my mistakes in, but as I come upon them during this voiceover, I'll try to point them out. But I really love how the card ended up, and so I'll probably make a similar card using the same mechanic, and hopefully that tutorial will go much more smoothly. Okay, so first off, mistake number one, my piece of black cardstock here, initially I cut that so that there would still be a little bit of a white border showing on my 6x6 card. Ultimately, I did need a full 6x6 matte layer for that piece of black cardstock. This is going to be our double slider mechanic. This is a really easy way of creating this mechanism. I just took a couple scrap paper pieces of cardstock. I use 120 pounds, so that's nice and sturdy. And there's a top and bottom strip that is about 1/4 of an inch tall, and it extends slightly beyond that middle panel there. And where that middle section is, that's where our conveyor belt is going to get attached. And by conveyor belt, I just mean a piece of plastic. I just used some plastic packaging from a probably from a stamp or a die set, and I wrap that around that middle section. You'll see that a little bit later. Now, on this top portion of the mechanism here, I'm only applying red line tape to that very top portion because unlike other double sliders I've made in the past, this one actually has a middle seam, and that is going to be this acetate panel that my Abigail doll from Paper Sweeties will get attached to. And so that acetate layer is going to get attached only to this top portion here. You want to make sure that nothing dips below that top panel and potentially interferes with the conveyor belt being able to kind of move smoothly. And so here I had a little bit of acetate that was a little bit too low, so I made sure to snip that off. That way later, as I attach, this is our conveyor belt right here. I know it's all clear, so it's very hard to see, but you just need a strip that's long enough to wrap around, and then you want to overlap it a little bit and attach it with some very strong tape. So I use score tape here, and I've just got a little bit of score tape on the very end. Now, when you wrap this, you don't want it super tight, but you don't want it so loose that it might fall out of that little channel that you've created. You just want it to be loose enough to smoothly glide back and forth. So this is our mechanism with the piece of acetate attached to it. And so my little Abigail doll will get attached to that piece of acetate. Attached to the conveyor belt from behind is going to be this snowy panel, which I think I took a snowflake stamp from the mini Sweeties set called Home, and just did some first and second generation stamping to create this background. And then I have her, sort of her winter coat, although technically this is from the spring, outfit. But even though it's meant to be, I think, more of a raincoat, I think it works as a winter coat too. So I've decided to make it a winter coat. And, that is going to glide along in front of the acetate. So we've got that snowflake backdrop behind the acetate, which will get attached to our conveyor belt. And then we've got the coat that will be attached to the front of the conveyor belt, and that's going to pass over top of our Abigail doll. So I did have to find an oval die that closely matched the proportions of the wonky scallop oval die set that I have from Paper Sweeties, and this one that I have from Crafter's Companion turns out to be the closest one. The aperture that it cuts out is a little bit larger than the aperture of the scalloped oval frame that I have, but that's okay because that means that the frame will still kind of block off that opening, so that works out just fine. So once I have that cut from the black layer, I die cut it also from my decorative layer, which was embossed using a Paper Discovery embossing folder. It's so, I didn't mention it at the beginning when I showed it, but I think it's from their Elegant Bathroom set or collection, which is so fantastic. I think the embossing folder is the only thing I have out of that collection, but I just thought it was a really cute collection. I just don't know if I'll ever use it other than this embossing folder. Anyhow, so I did have to re-stamp out another background panel because my original one just wasn't tall enough. I guess that's what I get for trying to use up scraps. So ultimately I did have to stamp out another panel. And I do that a lot where I just sort of trial run the mechanism just to make sure everything lines up correctly before I do any die cutting, before I do make any cuts. And here you can see I've trimmed off that black matte layer, and that was a mistake. Don't do that. You want to leave your topmost layer that still needs to be fully 6x6. Not too sure what I was thinking when I trimmed that off, but you definitely don't want to do that. I ended up having to reattach that piece by cutting just another strip. It's slightly noticeable, the seam that I end up with, but it's not the end of the world. It was better than trying to create or recutting that piece, especially since I didn't realize the mistake until way past this. So that's one of the things where once you get far enough along, you're past the point of no return, and it's better to just try to find a solution rather than start over. That's how I feel anyways. This is another mistake. So I was trying to use a piece of scrap acetate, and so I had a piece that was just large enough to cover this oval aperture, and so I sandwiched it in between my embossed panel and my black matte layer. That was a mistake because ultimately, and I didn't find this out until pretty much everything was glued shut, but because I attached things the way that I did, I created a little bit of a catch point. And my paper doll's coat didn't glide smoothly. So I would recommend actually using a full piece of acetate and having that be your backmost layer. Don't sandwich it in between your two top layers. Instead, put it on the backmost behind that black cardstock, because just that little bit of a difference in thickness between the black cardstock and the acetate creates a ridge. And the coat gets cut up on that ridge, and that's why it can't smoothly glide past it. Whereas if you just had a full piece of acetate there, then you don't have any catch points, and then the coat can glide. So here's where I fixed having trimmed off my 6x6 panel. So no worries, I just extended that, and now I'm gonna put the bottom portion of my scene here. And the embossing folder is awesome. It's actually a 5x7 embossing folder, and it will emboss both this really beautiful wallpaper sort of texture, and then you have the baseboard, and then you have wood paneling. So from brown colored cardstock, I just put a piece that was positioned just where the floorboards were in the embossing folder. So that way I can just get this sort of nice wood effect. And I did ink up my embossing folder with some clear Versamark, just so that when that pushes the impression into the dark cardstock, it creates a little bit of a darker shadow in those grooves. So now the other error that I made is I put foam adhesive along the top portion of my mechanism, and you don't need to do that. You'll see me actually pull that up later. So, yet another mistake. As I mentioned, or maybe I didn't, but it's been a while since I've made a double-sider, so I probably make the same mistake over and over again just because I don't make these double-siders often enough. So you don't need that extra layer of foam strips going across the top. Now, I do have foam in front of the acetate as well as behind. So ultimately, this card will have sort of a double thickness of acetate. And I'm going to pass Abigail through my Xyron to turn her into a sticker. That way there's adhesive edge to edge, and when I adhere her down to the acetate, she won't create a catch point. And, or at least it minimizes the chances of her being a catch point. Now, you could, and I might in the future when I make this style of card again, you could actually maybe laminate her, and that would completely enclose her in plastic, and that would guarantee that there's no catch point. Now here is just a piece of scrap pattern paper that I'm using as the backdrop behind the frame, and you saw I did put down some Scotch tape along the two long edges, and that is to smooth over what could be a catch point for our backdrop scene, the piece that I'm attaching now. Now, I did originally attach my snowflake panel with foam to the conveyor belt mechanism. You don't need to do that. It's actually better to attach it flush, but this was before I realized that I don't need all that extra foam at the top there. So you'll see me actually pull all of that up. Now, I did round the corners at the top of my panel, and the reason to do that is just in case as you're pushing and pulling this back and forth, the sharp, if it happens to tilt a little bit, the sharp corners of that panel won't kind of stab into the foam. Rather, because it's rounded, it'll just continue to kind of roll off that foam and glide on past. So that's the reason to round off those edges. And I did actually, I think off camera, trim the top of that panel just a smidge. I definitely need it to be tall enough to go beyond the frame, but I wanted a little bit of extra clearance so that it's not so tight and so close to that topmost strip of foam that I have. So I didn't mention it, but I did cut my pull tab from 120 pound. Here's where I pull off all that foam. And this is what you want it to look like. You want everything nice and flush, and that extra little bit of foam that I've got just floating in the middle of the acetate there, that's a stopper. So that's what's actually going to prevent this backdrop panel from gliding too far to the left. And so that's another reason why you want this panel to get attached flush to the mechanism. If it was attached with foam, it would essentially be at the same level as that stopper, and so the stopper wouldn't really work quite as effectively. So here, instead, because it's nice and flush, it's actually going to sit between the acetate and the back of our card. So they'll actually operate a lot better and a lot more smoothly. The pull tab, as I was mentioning, was just hand cut from 120 pound, and I attached 2 layers of 120 pound cardstock to start with, but I ultimately added a 3rd layer. I want that pull tab to be really strong. Now, once it's between the topmost layer, of the card, it's not gonna be so bendy because there's really no room for it to bend, but you still want it to be nice and strong. And I felt that 2 layers of 120 pound just wasn't enough. So once I've got 2 things fixed in place, so Abigail's fixed in her location, our backmost panel is fixed in its location, and then I was able to line up the coat while my pull tab was pulled out. And so here you see I've actually removed that top strip of foam adhesive. I still have a little bit of that black strip at the top there on my mechanism, and that's acting again as a bit of a stopper for our coat. And even though the back panel has its own stopper, which would ultimately stop the coat from moving too, because they are both attached to the same conveyor belt, having that extra or leaving that little strip of black foam at the top of the mechanism there, it actually helps the pull tab move more straight, because then it can't just wobble up and down. So it actually creates a little bit of a channel for your pull tab to glide between. So I would definitely recommend leaving that there, even though technically it doesn't really need to serve as a stopper. It's more serving as a channel for the pull tab to glide more linearly. And I did have this is the point when everything was glued down, and with liquid glue at that I realized I've got a little bit of a catch point with my coat. And so that's why, I totally recommend using a larger sheet of acetate as your backmost layer on the front portion of your card. To fix it, all I did was I just slipped in another layer of acetate. I didn't have to pull anything up because there's enough that was still open from the side that I could still slip a piece of acetate in. And ultimately I was able to fix it, and it made a world of a difference. So, just if you did it right in the first place, then you're not going to have the same troubles that I did. And I did leave my pull tab longer than I needed, so that while I'm testing and working, it's just a little bit easier to work with. But when I trimmed it down, I did leave it hanging beyond the 6x6 card, as you can see here. So, this is going to ultimately be a little bit wider than a 6x6 card because of that little pull tab that's kind of hanging out there. And I just felt like I didn't need to add a sentiment to this. It just seems like a really fun card to play with. And I did buy these 2 outfits specifically to make this card because I thought just by the looks of it that it would line up and one would cover the other perfectly, and in the end it did. So lots of things did work out for me in the end, but it was a little bit of work getting there. I hope that you enjoyed this card, and if I do make another one in the same style, I'll be sure to link to it at the end of this one. Until then, happy crafting and have a fantastic day. Thanks so much. Bye.